So this genesis of ICTs for Peace Foundation, which we had started together, the journey of ICT for Peace, myself more from the normative side, from the diplomatic side. Then when that is over, the real thing starts. What actually are we talking about? And so there we need real expertise. So he has not only been an avid observer and archivist and commentator on technology for peace, technology for peaceful purposes. For many years together we had worked with the United Nations, and so, but also from the human rights angle, from the normative governance angle, and so forth. And when we started, I think we were in the area, in the era of dumb phone, smartphone, crowdsourcing, satellite, drones, and now AI and fake news, and how that impacts peace. So with not further ado, I would like now to give you the floor on this very new topic. Sanjana, you will say, just back from California, for a meeting with one of the big social media companies. Before that he was in Zurich already, and we had a lecture at ETH. But now, Sanjana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much
for coming.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Daniel. It has been such a pleasure working with the foundation since 2006. And what a pleasure and privilege to be speaking with you here in Zurich. The Swiss immigration official now takes a look at my passport whenever I come in, and then he starts laughing. He or she starts invariably laughing, because the question I'm asked is, do I spend my life on an airplane? Because there are so many visa stamps and visas. I'm doing my doctoral studies now in New Zealand, which is the end of the world. The flight from Auckland to Dubai is 17 and a half hours. So it really is quite special now to come to Europe and civilization, as it were. But I'm very, very happy to be here. I will not be talking generally about artificial intelligence. I think Regina here and there are experts in the audience who will more broadly be able to tackle that issue. What I will, however, be talking about is what's up there, the nexus, the connection between AI and this term, this phrase, this fear, this anxiety called fake news. And to give you a glimpse of maybe what we are talking about and what we are so concerned about as a global community, maybe as Swiss citizens, but certainly as a Sri Lankan and many others now working in this area, whether you're an academic or not, it doesn't really matter. And part of the challenge, I think, with this term fake news is that it doesn't mean anything. When you have the likes of Trump or Duterte or Putin say that the likes of the New York Times or what we would consider in this room, I hope, to be credible, reputable news sources, to be also fake news. When anything that contests your political authority and your dictatorial slant or your authoritarianism is also considered to be fake news, the question is, what is fake news? And how do we make sense of this term if everybody is using it? I don't know whether you saw recently, there was an interview with the former mayor of New York, Giuliani, and he said that truth is not truth. It's a hilarious interview because the anchor said this is instantly going to become a bad meme. You have these it recalls for people, I think, of a certain persuasion, of a certain age, the Rumsfeldian quote from many years ago during the time of the Gulf War, where there were known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and we all laughed about it at the time. But this phenomenon, this term called fake news, I think needs to be disabused. In academia, we don't use it. No serious person looking into misinformation or disinformation really uses the term. The only reason I use it today is because it's easy to kind of refer to amongst friends the issues we are talking about, and I think that we are all aware about, at least in Zurich in Switzerland. I would hesitate really to use it in any other context or in many other contexts without a qualification that it doesn't really mean too much in a world where the term itself is appropriated and weaponized by people who don't want their political authority to be questioned. So what's up there, and I think, Daniel, I think we can share this presentation later on, so those who want to take notes don't need to take copious notes down. This will be available later on, is a disambiguation, is a kind of explanation as to what we are really concerned about. This is from a group called First Draft, which does a lot of work on this issue. And they categorize mis and disinformation into these 7 types. Of course, the boundaries, the defining parameters are porous. These are not set in stone. In some contexts, it's very difficult to kind of distinguish between one or the other. But this is a kind of typology that helps us understand the nature of what we mean precisely when we say that we are dealing with fake news. Some of it actually might be quite innocent. Some of it might be satire and parody, which means no real harm to anybody, but is definitionally speaking fake. Some of it, though, might actually be intended to mislead with an intended outcome that is harmful, hurtful, or hateful. And that actually can be quite dangerous. And that is the kind of bias that we will have today in this 1 hour looking at this issue. So fake news as a term is something that I don't really use, but we will be using it today to speak to some of the issues in this typology here. Now, it's not just us here who are interested in it. This is just something anybody can get off Google Trends. This is the worldwide interest in the search terms artificial intelligence, fake news, and an associated phrase or term called machine learning. And you can see that I took 2016 with the view of the United States presidential election in mind, and you can see, generally speaking, the interest in all 3 have gone up. So a lot of people around the world are really searching for this phrase or term to get a handle on what it really means. Now, many of us would think that you need a Sanjana Hattatur or a Regina to talk about AI. And I think that we sometimes tend to forget how pervasive artificial intelligence is already in our lives. It's like the microwave or the toaster. We don't think too much about it, but we use it every day. It's become technology that is part and parcel of our lives, and we don't really think too much about it. And this is called specialized or vertical artificial intelligence that is designed with a specific purpose in mind, with a specific output or outcome in mind. And it's like drinking Coke. I don't know how many of you drink Coke. Some of you hate Coke. There are all sorts of varieties of Coke without sugar now. But sometimes it's bad for you. I mean, I like a Coke sometimes with a Chinese meal. It goes down really well. And this is a classic example of what we grew up with in Sri Lanka. You go out for Chinese and you have Coke. It's something that is in our DNA. And it's bad. It's bad, but my God, it tastes so good. With ice and, for that one glass, my mouth waters even now when I talk about it. But you don't know what the recipe is. You have no access to the recipe. You don't really know what goes into it. It's quite bad for you in terms of sugar, but you can't stop yourself always easily from drinking it. You always yearn for it, no matter how bad it is to consume at length or in vast quantities. And this is Google, for example. And lots of people don't know that the Google search engine is designed at the back end from artificial intelligence. The results I get when I took this will be very different to the results you get. This is Microsoft Bing. The results you get will be very different to what I get, because it kind of knows who I am, what I search for, and where I'm searching it from. Facebook, I think, is the ultimate example of artificial intelligence, in a sense of an algorithm that serves us content designed to satiate what we like. This is Twitter. This is my news feed on Twitter, showing me stuff that I have subscribed to, that I'm interested in. I don't know whether Spotify is in Switzerland, but Spotify is one of the earliest examples of artificial intelligence in how it selects songs for you. This is Amazon, and you know, if I go to my Amazon, the recommendations for me are based entirely on the history of my purchases on the platform, and actually it's extremely sophisticated AI giving me things that I might like to buy from Amazon. So it kind of tries to hook me in, and it usually works actually with books at least. This is Flipboard, a news engine that gives you access to news that you like. YouTube, I don't know how many of you know, and this is an example of it. So if I look at a particular video on YouTube, when you come to the end of the video, it comes up with a recommendation to keep you what you call binge watching. And the recommendation for the next video, this is actually hugely contentious. I'll talk about it a bit more and you can ask me questions about it. The recommendation for the next video is actually based on what you have seen and what you just saw. So it bases itself on your video viewing history on YouTube and what you have just seen. So here, it's, as you can see, it's giving me more and more content on American talk shows linked to political content. This is happening algorithmically. So you know, it's going to give me another episode, you know, featuring Trevor Noah on the kinds of things that I have just seen. And then finally we have Netflix, which is also just an artificial intelligence engine. Netflix, I don't know whether you know, changes the recommendations that I see. It's quite incredible actually. Depending on the time of day I go to Netflix, it will give me a different movie set in the morning, it will give me a different movie set in the evening, and I don't know whether you notice, it will give you a different movie set based on the emotions of the people watching Netflix in my geographic area at that time. So this is an incredible, this and Spotify are some of the most incredible commercial AI, and we don't really think about it, we don't talk about it in terms of AI, we just talk about it in terms of, oh my God, this Netflix showed me a video I would never have seen otherwise. So we're generally quite happy when it shows us something that we want to buy or we want to watch. And that is, I think, the first lesson, in a sense. Can you escape it? I think Swiss people are very, and the Germans, who when I've lectured in Germany, are very, very cautious and careful, and rightfully so, about privacy. And don't like all of this, in a sense. But can you escape it, really? You know, in this audience, I think all of you have an Android phone or an iPhone. And if you have either one, you're really giving voluntarily as well as involuntarily, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, intelligence to the company that built it, either Apple or Google. Every single time that you turn on your phone, intelligence that goes into its artificial intelligence engines, and we know it as Siri. In fact, one of the nice things that happened this week is that I was followed on Twitter by the original voice of Siri, who's a woman in America. Now she's a tech consultant. But Siri actually is not an individual. It's Apple's artificial intelligence program. By terms of sophistication, I think Google is way ahead of everybody else. And this is Google Assistant. It's already part of your latest Android phone. The Pixel 3 is going to be released in about a week or two. And this is going to be the default kind of, it's going to be baked into the operating system. And this is leagues ahead. I can talk about it a bit more, but Google it's almost like science fiction today in terms of the sophistication that Google Assistant has, even in comparison to Siri. I don't know how many of you have Alexa at home. It's bloody disturbing for me to have a speaker that can listen to you all the time, but millions of people do. Alexa comes in various forms. Alexa comes in a small little disc, it comes in a big speaker. It's what you call smart speakers. You can listen to music, but you can also say, Alexa, you know, what's the weather in Colombo, Sri Lanka? Or Alexa, what's my appointment? Or Alexa, what's in the fridge? And you know, people have now incorporated this into their lives. And in fact, there's some really interesting academic study around the psychology of children who abuse Alexa. And that's really interesting psychological studies around the human-machine interaction and how, in a sense, in the interaction with these artificial intelligence platforms, it sometimes tends to bring out the worst of us in our interactions. We have, I don't know how many of you use Windows 10, but Microsoft Cortana, or Cortana, I don't know how you pronounce this, is baked into Windows 10. It's also baked now into other devices that Microsoft produces. And this is also another artificial intelligence engine. I don't know how many of you use it on Windows 10, but it's pretty sophisticated because you also get it on Bing as well. And then if some of you have a Galaxy, the new Galaxy phones, the S9 or the S10, or the new phones that released this year, Samsung has its own digital assistant called Bixby. It got off to a shaky start. Didn't quite understand what you asked it in the first instance, but now actually it's fairly robust. It's kind of Samsung's answer to Siri. It's kind of Samsung's answer to Google's Assistant. So that's a whole different artificial intelligence engine. So if you buy a new Samsung phone today, you actually get two incredible artificial intelligence engines. You get the Google one, which is baked into Android, and you get the custom Samsung Bixby. And so that's the kind of world that we live in. So it's not easy to get out from these paradigms. You can't get out from AI even if you don't trust it. I think that's the first lesson. It's all around us. Frankly, if you use the internet, if you have a smartphone today, it doesn't matter whether you're on social media or not, you're already part of AI. You are already voluntarily giving up your data to these companies. There's no if and or but, whether it's conscious or not. My point though is that when you're talking about AI and fake news or false news or mis or disinfo, you can't talk about it in a vacuum. And it's entirely contextually driven. So the conversation we'll have here in Zurich, in light of the federal legislation that is being mooted and the public comment that they've asked, is going to be very different if I had it in Joburg in South Africa, to Vietnam and Cambodia, to New Zealand, to Australia, to my home country in Sri Lanka. And that is, I think, the first principle of this. It is deeply contextual. What might not be a problem here in Zurich and Switzerland may actually be a huge problem in other contexts and other socio-political domains. So the first thing is that we need to locate this in a contextual sense. And one of the things that we need to consider is the way the world has changed. And I don't have the statistics for Switzerland, but I'm going to give you some snapshots around the way that millennials, people born after the 1990s, Daniel and Hong have a son who belongs to this generation. I have a 12-year-old who is going to find it entirely normal that they have these touch devices and these smartphones and the internet and the web and these AI platforms. What we are concerned about, they are not concerned about. They are still very concerned about privacy, but I think we need to understand how these millennials understand news and information frameworks. This is one example, and this is what my doctoral studies, in a sense, is also going to look at from a Sri Lankan perspective. What you see here is that the 18 to 29 demographic, the primary means of how they get news and information is through online means. It's fundamentally different from other demographics who get it off cable television, terrestrial radio, or God forbid, anything that they are recommended to read in the newspapers. None of my younger friends read the newspaper as paper. They read it online, they read it over Facebook, they read it over email sometimes, they read it when it's shared by their friends over WhatsApp or instant messaging, but there is absolutely no interest in reading NZZ as a newspaper, for example. And this is extremely important for us to recognize, because the way in which this demographic, which is actually going to be, at least in my countries and my part of the world, they are the first time voters, they are the most active, politically active population in all of our countries. They are the ones who go out and vote. They are the ones whose vote now matters quite a bit for the next government or the current government. It matters a great deal. And that is why academic studies also is extremely interested in that demographic, because they are the future of our countries. And how they get news and information really matters. And it matters because there is a disconnect, at least in Sri Lanka and many other parts of the world, not Switzerland, between adult literacy and media literacy. And people usually conflate the two. Adult literacy is the number of adults in a population who can read or write. Yeah, so in Sri Lanka it's extremely high, it's about 96%. We are the highest in the South Asian region. Every other country is much, much less. But what we have a unique, almost unique problem in my country is that we have a very poor media literacy. What does that mean? Simply, it means that we don't critically question what we consume on our devices. If we get something from Facebook, we believe it. If we get something on Twitter, we believe it. If we get something over WhatsApp, we believe it. And worse, we will go and do something about it. So if I hear that somebody is burning my friends, I don't go to question, is it true, is it not, where is it happening, who is doing it? I will go and burn some of the people who are purported to be the attackers. And so it has this awful effect, a contagion effect of people who can read and write but don't know how to critically question what they consume. And this is why rumors spread like wildfire. This is a research that we did 2 years ago in Sri Lanka. I want you to take a look at that column on the right. We have around 6 million on Facebook. We have around 15 to 20%, depending on which statistic you believe, connected to the internet. All of that is actually irrelevant. What most people tell me is that sometimes it's not really a problem, because very few people still in our countries are really connected to social media. So they're not really, fake news is not really a problem. In Sri Lanka we have 21 million people, only 6 million are connected to Facebook, so it's not really a problem. The problem is that when people from the 18 to 34 or say 20 to 40 demographic read something or consume something or see something, what do they do? What do they do? They go and tell their parents, they go and tell their friends, they go and tell their neighbors, they go and tell their colleagues. They go and tell somebody who may not be connected to social media. So what you say is that the footprint of influence, of content that is primarily digital, is much larger, wider and greater than just those who are connected. That's really, really important. So it's not just 6 million who are influenced by digital content, it's actually much greater. It could be twice or thrice that number in any country in the world. And that's not something that you always often think about, because when you talk about statistics, we always talk about people who are connected, people who use, people who share, people who engage, but actually the footprint of influence and what you call influence operations can actually be much larger. And that leads us to, we're going to go to some frames as to how to understand this. This is an academic term, it's called the bandwagon effect. And that means that if you see something on your news feed, what do? You like it, you share it immediately. You see it, you share it sometimes, and oftentimes people don't even read what they share. They read it only after liking or only after sharing it amongst their friends. Because why? You got it from a friend. There are lots of psychoanalytical studies around this, and it's called the bandwagon effect because we trust psychologically the content that we get over social media because it comes from quote-unquote friends. Now, when I grew up, a friend was somebody I knew physically, or I went to school with, or I was in class with. But now you have friends that are in their thousands on Facebook, and I think the definition of friends have also shifted. But our understanding of trust, because it's a friend, hasn't kept up with that. So what you get now is a hyper-personalized, deeply personalized news feed and a shareability kind of built in to that. What is the problem? The problem is that you can't understand any of this text. This is from March in Sri Lanka. In March, we had the worst communal violence in Sri Lanka. So bad, I had to postpone my departure for doctoral studies because I had to deal with this at also a governmental level with the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister himself. When we had mobs attacking and killing Muslims in a part of my country in the central region. It's the worst communal violence we've faced, and I've lived through quite a bad time. Talk about that a bit later. But this was the content that was shared over WhatsApp and Facebook, and less so on Twitter. But this is Facebook and WhatsApp. And this content is actually really horrible. It would be difficult for me to sometimes translate some of this in a company like this, because it would entail very harsh and violent images against women. And I can't also translate some of that without using expletives. It's bad. Some of it is so bad that for a person like myself who studied conflict resolution, some of this content here is reminiscent of the content put out by Radio Mille Collines in pre-genocide Rwanda. It's extremely bad. And this is the kind of content that was spreading like wildfire over Facebook and social media writ large, just before and during the communal violence in the country. And that is the problem. That is the bandwagon effect. this kind of content tends to be shared very widely. Algorithmically, it's fueled by the kind of algorithms that these social media platforms are based on. And then you have this, I mean, you can't read all of this. This is from a report by the fact-finding mission on Myanmar, conducted by the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights, based in Geneva. They released the preliminary report in August, and 2 days ago, they released the full report. It's 444 pages. This is from 431 and I think 432, and point 1723 and 1724 talk about the complicity of Facebook and other social media in the genocide in Myanmar. This is not a joke. This is the first time that the United Nations has said that Facebook in particular and social media in general has been inextricably entwined in genocide. I mean, you know, this is not something that company is going to go out. We don't know where it's going to go. As you know more than most, the situation in Myanmar is quite bad even now, but this is very, very serious. And Facebook is mentioned explicitly in the report. And this is what we have been warning these companies around for a while. Why does this happen? It doesn't happen in Zurich. If I said something around killing all the Stauffackers in Zurich, it's not going to result in people going and killing Daniel. If I said Hong looks Chinese and we need to kill and get rid of all the Chinese, it's not going to result in mob violence against the Chinese in Zurich. Why does this happen? It doesn't happen elsewhere in the world where Facebook is used. So one of the ways in which you can understand this and the role of AI is in countries and contexts where what you would call there is a democratic deficit, where the institutions of democracy have for decades been eviscerated by political actors, where there is no trust in the mechanisms of governance, or where the trust in the mechanisms of governance is not very high. And in that kind of context, you find that artificial intelligence and the algorithms that social media is powered by have a very, very dangerous impact. This is the country I grew up in. I was in my first year of school in 1983 when I walked back home with my grandmother, looking at things that a 6-year-old shouldn't be looking at, which included, you know, things like people being burnt alive. This was the start of our 27-30-year-old war. And this was the media at the time. These are from the National Archives. And what's interesting is that there's little coverage of the riots. You know, the government of the day, which was complicit in the violence, put out its own propaganda. And if you were a reader or a subscriber of any one of these newspapers, and I have lots more, there's nothing really happening in Sri Lanka. You wouldn't even know that there was a riot. And this was devastating. And so propaganda is not new, and that is also something that must be very strongly told. Fake news or misinfo and disinfo is not new. Anybody from the former Soviet Republic, the USSR, knows this, or from Eastern Europe. So it's not a new phenomenon for some of us. But what has changed, and I think an interesting thing that an academic or a writer like Zeynep Tufekci also makes recently in the media, is that ironically, in that old system where you had a few newspapers, maybe partisan and, you know, very deeply partial to the state, you still had them acting as gatekeepers. You didn't have anything else. You didn't have social media. You had no other way of ascertaining what was going on in the country. You only had that media. So yes, it wasn't reporting accurately, but you still had an understanding of a common narrative. Yeah, and those media became the gatekeepers or the arbiters of truth. There was no way in which you could get a contesting opinion. Today, if you don't believe NZZ, you'll go to some other site and get an alternative opinion. In those days, as recently in a sense as 1983 or the 80s, you didn't have that. And so these media became de facto gatekeepers. So when I was growing up, when I switched on the television, there were only 2 channels. That's it. There was no cable, there was no internet, there was no web, there was no smartphone, there was nothing. There was just 2 channels. And depending on, at 8 o'clock in the night, depending on which channel you look for the news, that's what you talked about the day after, what you saw. But everybody talked about it. It didn't matter which political persuasion you had, everybody talked about the 8 o'clock news, because that's all you had. And so there was a common baseline, a foundation, whether you agreed or not, that everybody had a national discussion around. You don't have that anymore. You don't have an 8 o'clock news that people watch together as a family to base their discussions the day after. Everybody is now tuned in or follows what they want. And there is no commonality or a foundation. And that is a problem for the next couple of slides that I'll show. So you have this erosion of a common thread. Sri Lanka, for example, or Malaysia or Vietnam or Cambodia or India, there's no common understanding of the country. It depends very much on who you speak to, what language they talk, where they are, what age they are, and how they get the news and information. So that has splintered, in a sense, a country, as much as the democratization has also occurred through social media. This is, for example, the United States. The United States is an interesting example because these problems are not just with my country, they're also now with a country that you would never have imagined would be faced with these issues. So take a look at this. This is a data visualization of how much partisanship has grown since the 1990s. And what's interesting is that the partisan divide starts growing just around when Obama is elected for the first time. And it never comes together again. So America today, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is historically divided more than any other time in its history. The Democrats and the Republicans really don't see eye to eye. And this is counterintuitive because social media, what was it? It's supposed to bring us all together. Remember the promise of the internet? It was supposed to be a global village, and social media was supposed to come up with different perspectives and give us different views of the world. It's not happening. It's not happening in the United States. And this is another data visualization of a company that shows millions and millions of tweets. This is a company called Graphica, and they came up with this about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it looks like a heart, it's inadvertent, but you can see that the color separation, which is explained as well, means that you're looking at a country that is deeply divided. Ideally, it would be a hodgepodge of all the colors together, like a painter's palette. It's not like a painter's palette. People who believe in the Democrats don't even mingle with, read, consume, engage, or are aware of anything that is pro-Trump, and vice versa. So it depends pretty much on what you would like to believe and the media you would consume, and the country is really divided. There's no cross-fertilization of political opinion and framing. And then that leads to the question of AI and social media, which is that these algorithms which give us now choice add to the tyranny of choice. I was in Facebook on Monday and Tuesday, and I went to get a bottle of water from their corporate fridge, which is huge. It's about the size of that entire wall there. And I just wanted a bottle of water, but I had to stand there and like, my God, there's so much of choice here. I just want a bottle of water. There's watermelon water, there's grape water, there's orange water, then there's all sorts of non-aerated drinks, there's sugar drinks, there's non-sugar drinks, there's caffeine, decaffeinated, I just want water. And I had to stand there and then just you wonder where the hell is the water. So there's a tyranny of choice, and when this happens in a democratic deficit, it can be quite dangerous. You can't necessarily read this, but in my country, my doctoral studies are based on a very disturbing phenomenon where people's frames of what happens in the country is now driven by gossip sites, not by mainstream media. That's an entirely new phenomenon, and it's very, very dangerous for years ahead. It's not just a problem for the current government, it's a societal problem, and I have been writing to my Prime Minister about this, because it's not just about the next election, it's about many elections. And the problem is that these gossip sites, which I'm tracking, about 51 of them, by order of magnitude, get more people to engage, reach more people, and put more content out. And that's a problem, because what they would report on and how they would report on and the subjects they would report on and the frames they would report using are extremely problematic. They're partial, they're partisan, they're biased, they're sexist, they're violent, they're exclusive. And yet, millions of people, the first and sometimes only awareness of something that happens in the country is through these gossip sites. And there is something else that is also extremely disturbing. There is no cognitive differentiation or distinction made that what they consume is gossip. For them, it is news. There is no distinction between the fact that it is a gossip site and not a mainstream media site. And that it leads to this. This is the partisan bias. You don't need to understand this, but can you see any connection between the top spaghetti and the bottom spaghetti? This spaghetti actually is an information visualization of how people on some of the leading political pages, official political pages of politicians, including the Prime Minister and President, as well as the opposition and their political parties interact. And the point is that if you are a pro-government or you're pro-opposition, there is no interaction whatsoever. Zero, zilch. That is extremely dangerous because you don't really understand what the other political camp or group is talking about. And again, this is a visualization of millions and millions of interactions. And so that's the problem. You have an algorithm or algorithmic divisions democratizing the access to information, but also ironically creating a splintering of our understanding around the world, of the world and our country. And you also have this thing around, and I told you earlier that people don't understand that they're looking at gossip. You have what I would call the morphing markers of veracity. What do I mean by that? So those of a particular generation, and I think that all of us here in this room are of that demographic. I mean, we grew up liking, not necessarily seeing, but liking things that we associate, for example, the NZZ with, some authority. When you pick up the NZZ, you know that you're getting an authoritative, reasoned, well-researched, balanced, impartial view of the world or a particular issue. Whether you agree with it or not, you know that it's a reputable media or institution that has a reputational risk if they screw up. But when you talk to millennials, whether it's in China, India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Cambodia, or wherever, in the Middle East, in MENA countries, or the United States or Canada, they have a very different understanding of it. For them, it's what's come on their screen. For them, it's how quickly can I share this. For them, it's how attractive is it? Is it vibrant? Is it aesthetically pleasing? Does it look cool? Does it give me something in 15 seconds as I'm scrolling through with my thumb on the way to work or my school? So the markers of veracity are fundamentally different. This is also not something that you realize unless you actually talk to the people who consume the news from that demographic using the tools, apps and services that they use. We don't get it. We tend to believe that the young people today have the same markers of trust and veracity as we do. They don't. Doesn't mean that they are not interested in trust or accuracy. It's just that they have a very different understanding of it. And that needs to be something that we need to take into account when we talk about this. What is UI and context flattening? With that last slide in mind, what the likes of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and all these platforms do is that they make very disparate sources look the same. So in academic terms, you call this context flattening. Now, for example, take a look at this. I have CNN, Fox, Mr. Trump, Breitbart, and the New York Times. Now, for somebody who didn't know what the political persuasion of each of these are, it all looks the same on Facebook. That's what you call UI. UI is user interface design. And on Facebook, everything looks exactly the same. If you picked up NZZ, if you picked up The Economist, if you picked up Time, if you picked up Reader's Digest, if you picked up the New York Times, if you picked up Le Monde, and if you picked up say the Hindustan Times, they would all look very different to each other. You would never confuse CNN with Fox, and you'd never confuse Fox with Discovery Channel. But on social media, it all looks the same. And this, in a context of democratic deficit, and where people don't quite know how to deal with the information that they see, means that they consider all of this to be the same. They don't have necessarily the ability to say that Fox News is of one political persuasion, Mr. Trump is of another political persuasion, and the New York Times is of a very different political persuasion to the rest that is up on the screen, because it all looks the same. So this is what you call context flattening. You don't really get a context and insight into what the media is on, that is projected and promoted and promulgated and engaged with over social media algorithmically by millions of a particular demographic. That leads to the risk vector of what is in academic terms called computational propaganda. Propaganda we know, it's old. What is computational propaganda? This is one risk vector of what you would call, when you, one respect in the domain of fake news and AI studies. Computational propaganda is the use of algorithms and social media in general to put out misinfo and disinfo at scale. At scale and at a scope and at a speed vastly different to decades before, but also what you would call hyper-personalized. So just because it targets millions doesn't mean that it's a general message. This is the whole controversy about dark ads, if you've heard about it, during the 2016 presidential election in the United States, where certain people saw certain content that played to their political anxiety, and it was invisible to the rest. And so this is what you would call, many aspects of this, but this is what you would call computational propaganda. And when you talk about computational propaganda, this is from the Brookings Institute, generally what you now talk about, at least in your part of the world, is about Russia, because everybody's scared about Mr. Putin. And then you have things like full spectrum dissemination, deployment of computational propaganda, social vulnerabilities. You have a whole new vocabulary that you have to learn in order to study what is happening today. And it is, for me, both interesting, but as a global citizen also bloody frightening. Because many of us don't understand to even begin to critically question what is going on. Because in a sense it's very technical, but it's also so pervasive. I mean, you know, it's generally now the case that if you have a general election, a referenda, a plebiscite, at any level, national or regional or local, you're going to have this. You're going to have what are called information operations from bad faith actors who want to shape the information landscape in a way that promotes a particular agenda, a partisan framework, or promotes and strengthens an intended outcome. And it's a very frightening world. And what are three fundamental ways that are, AI and fake news and misinfo and disinfo kind of influence this? One is by the amplification of partisan frames. So if I am talking here from the lectern, and if all of you start shouting, what happens to me? Something different or inimical to what I say, my voice is drowned out and your voice wins. And that is why some of these techniques are to kind of amplify what you want to amplify. And as a consequence of doing that, you tend to drown out other voices. So the new censorship is not censoring by blocking. The new censorship is censoring by flooding, so that you don't get to hear important critical voices. And what I said is that you see distrust at scale. The kind of confusion you create is that nobody believes anything. When nobody believes anything, it's actually very helpful for authoritarian regimes, because then everything is fake news. New York Times is fake news, what I'm saying is fake news. When you have no real trust anchor, when everything is up for grabs, that is a huge benefit for authoritarian rule. And I always say, sometimes, I don't know how many of you in the audience have been thinking about this, arguably you have, because that's why you're here. But sometimes when I tend to explain this, this is a NASA image from a river, I think in Burkina Faso. It doesn't really matter. This is a river. It's an actual river, by the way, and taken from space with false spectrum imaging and colorization. But this is the political landscape of any country. You have dominant strains, you have other political ideas coming in and fertilizing the main river. You have separate rivulets, which are separate political ideologies. All of them exist in the same space. Some of them meet, some of them diverge, some of them converge and become larger ideas. But this is, in a sense, the kind of discursive discussion of a particular country's politics and social relations. So you have to think about social media as a river taken from space. Now what happens is that you can manipulate this image. You can shift it and change it to make it appear to be, for example, that any one area is bigger than the other. So it's like Photoshop. So think about computational propaganda as photoshopping your public discourse. And that's a very, very easy way to understand the nature of what we are talking about. Now, what I do is not just academics. I have been an activist on the ground, and I want to give you a few frames of what it looks like from the real world. This is at the time of the violence in March. This was a completely false, misleading tweet. It has no basis in factual reality, but it's clearly directed against a particular community and put up at a time to inflame violence. Now, many of you would read the text and look at the photo, but if you're in Sri Lanka and you read this at the time, you would also be very concerned. What is interesting is that nobody reads just under the photo where this tweet was published from. So your information literacy on Twitter, which I think many of us in this room also use daily, doesn't extend to figuring out when it's available, even explicitly available and there, where this tweet was coming from. So you're talking about violence in Sri Lanka, but you're tweeting from Frankfurt in Germany. How the hell do you know what's happening in Sri Lanka on the ground if you're in Frankfurt? Right? So these are easy markers of information operations. And there were many like this. Some of them didn't have this geolocation. But this is what we try to respond to and say this is not true at the time. I have done a lot of research. This is the former president's son. And the former president's son is leading in Sri Lanka the ways in which Twitter, his personal Twitter account and his followers' Twitter accounts can be weaponized. And this is what you call through fake news, fake accounts, bots, if you've heard it. And all of these individuals at the bottom are actually real individuals. They actually are alive, but they have all been put to accounts which are fake. So they are real individuals used to promote fake accounts, and obviously these fake accounts put out a lot of content that is partial to the former president's son's political opinion. And what's interesting is that when we put this out, the immediate pushback we got was from this entire troll farm. Right? And so that was, in a sense, a vindication and validation of our research, because this is the kind of pushback that we got. And I don't have time for it, but if you take a look at the timeline, all of these tweets came out in a particular time frame, which led us to believe that it's no more than about 1 or 2 people in control of all of these accounts. Right? And this is the kind of information operation that you have going on. Then we followed up with another report, a data-driven report on the weaponization of Twitter. This, at the time that it came out, was a real problem for South and Southeast Asia. There was what you call a Twitter bot infestation. It was like everybody was catching a cold on Twitter, but it was happening to millions of people, mostly activists. It was a real systemic problem, not just a Sri Lankan problem. And the point that we made was that because Twitter wasn't really responding to the scale of the issue, that this is a harbinger. This is a preface, a warning of how bad it could be during electoral contests in the future, and how it could be weaponized. This is another example. This is from the Maldives from earlier this year, where this hashtag Maldives in crisis was at a time when there was a constitutional crisis in the country. I don't know how much you know about the Maldives, but it's going through a very bad time. And activists put up this Maldives in crisis hashtag, and what the pro-government trolls then did was what you call hashtag hijacking. So they got trolls to use the hashtag Maldives in crisis to promote beaches and hotels. So you had hundreds of comments promoted through Twitter. Sometimes they bought ads as well to kind of drown out the critical commentary using that hashtag. We reported it, and Twitter actually ended up banning and blocking for the violation of service many of those accounts. I didn't know this, but we became overnight a sensation in the media in the Maldives for what we did, because these bots had been attacking activists on the ground for many, many months. And because of what we did, they were taken off. So it was an interesting kind of result of our research. This is more recent. This is from Shahidul Alam. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a famous photographer. He's currently imprisoned in Bangladesh. He's been tortured in prison as well. He's a friend of mine. So we are all very, very concerned for him on completely spurious grounds. But what happened was that the hashtag associated with him began about a month ago in August to be taken over by certain accounts. And when I did a computational analysis of it, it was all linked to what you would call the Awami League, the government, or Sheikh Hasina, who's the president, and her son. So there was a systemic connection of all the accounts in their hundreds that linked them to a pro-government source. So that was the data visualization that came up. And when I put this up, it soon stopped it because this became a news story. Then they tried a different trick. So they learn. So bad faith actors learn as well. This is from about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And here they started another trend of taking over that hashtag and those accounts that we want him released. Now, what's interesting here is that there was no obvious connection between the accounts. So I did my analysis and there was no connection. It appeared to be people who are genuinely thinking, independent of each other, that actually he should be in prison and tortured a bit more. But when I looked at and this is what we call information operations, when I looked at the links that had been shared by the accounts, when I looked at the domains that had been shared by the accounts, then you find an amazing correlation of the top 5 or top 10 around all the accounts being very pro-government. So there was no link between all the accounts, but there was a definite, verifiable, data-driven partiality and bias. And then when we put this up, it stopped as well. Yeah. So this is the cat and mouse. This is what we do in terms of responding to, from a very basic level, what you would call information operations that are exacerbated by the landscape that we're talking about. Now, you might think that AI is bad. I don't know if anybody here is from the media or from NZZ, but it's not all bad. There's some good things that are happening with artificial intelligence as well. And there are 4 ways in which it's happening. It might not be happening in Switzerland, but it's definitely happening in the United States. One is for content discovery, for the framing of context, for comment moderation, and a new thing called natural language generation. And that's entirely new. So this is one example where the Washington Post is using artificial intelligence to write stories. So some of the stuff that comes out on their Twitter account is completely machine generated. And they're using this for 2 things at the present moment. They're using it for sports figures, and they're using it for financial data. And some of the updates, say from baseball, or they don't have cricket there, but I don't know what the Americans play. They call it American football. I've never understood that game. But all of those sports scores and the player statistics, etc., are now reported using complete machine automation. It's completely machine driven because you have a lot of data around those two. This is from Reuters. These are all reputed media platforms. They have a new tool called Links Insight that is around what you call discoverability. So in their newsroom, they have AI running that tells a reporter, if my beat is, say, the White House, it will go through all the wire services, all the news reports, everything that is in the archives, and it will surface content to my desk on my dashboard saying, okay, this is important because this is what has been said by that person then, and in this context, using that platform. So it will give the reporter some insight into a story that he or she should be reporting on. That they can then go on and report. It's not automatically writing, but it's what you call surfacing content, discovering the discoverability of content. Then you have WAPO, the Washington Post, as well as the New York Times, using AI for comment moderation. This is extremely sophisticated. They use 2 different platforms. WAPO has an in-house thing called Modbot. The New York Times is actually running on Google. It's a platform called Google Perspective. It's all open source and open for anybody to use, except Modbot, which is of course only Washington Post. But these are platforms that kind of try to take away the hate that is generated by content and allow the paper to kind of have a civil discourse on the content that put out on the web. And this is a company called Narrative Science. It's not just the only company, there are others doing it as well. And this is that 4th category called natural language generation. The easiest to understand this, and I suppose the lawyers would be very pleased about this, is that you can feed it reams and reams of data. So say, 20 years of financial reports or 10 years of Supreme Court judgments. And then you can ask the system a natural language query. Tell me all the respondents or appellants around a particular case, or tell me this company's stock price over a particular time, and it will come out, the result will be in natural English. Right? So it will give you a response in what you call natural language generation. It just won't give you something like Google, which is just a links-based system. So this is also AI running in the background. So I want to frighten you a bit, though. This is the good stuff. But there's also a lot of stuff that is, when I say frighten, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but I wanted to give you a sense of where we are at today. Now, Daniel is recording me. He also took some photos about when I spoke. But does that mean that 10 years down the line that the recording that we have of today will have exactly what I said? Now, we don't know, and that's because of some things that I'm going to show you. There is an Adobe platform called Adobe. It's still beta. It's not released, but it will be released. I know many of you know Adobe for Photoshop. This is Photoshop for audio. It's called Project VOCO, VOCO. And if you look at it on YouTube, it is mind-blowing, right? You can make anybody say anything in their voice. You can edit out things that are inconvenient. You can put in things that they never said. And audibly, it's indistinguishable from that person's voice. And so they want to release this, so it's going to be Photoshop for audio. Right? So I can say that Daniel is, a wonderful person, and Hong can go and change it to Daniel is an idiot. Yeah, and you won't be able to determine with what I said, and this is a huge problem for society and for politics, particularly in a democratic deficit. Now, how many of you can break dance? Now, for those of you shaking your head, actually that's a trick question because you can break dance, at least using AI. So this is the actual dancer, and she's not doing that. This is real-time mapping of one subject to another. This is real-time mapping, I'm just going to mute this, of what that gentleman is doing onto a subject who is not doing any of that. So what you're seeing is not real. And there's another source video, and this woman is doing exactly what that woman is doing. Now, this is the cutting edge. This came out this year, and you would see that it's not. If you look at it closely, you can kind of figure out something's not right. But the technology improves by leaps and bounds every single year, and so 2 years down the line, I wonder where this is all going. So this is another example, and I want to skip to the end, which is where they're doing ballet. Right? This is real-time mapping of a ballerina's pirouettes onto two subjects who are not doing it. This is where we are at. Yeah. And this is another really disturbing phenomenon of making somebody say in video what they didn't say.
It got me thinking about my full-time employees and their ability to survive on $8 an hour in New York City. And foremost in all of our minds has been the loss and the grief felt by the people who are landowning. Most of us don't get our health care through money.
So apologize for the like the voice, the audio and the video is not synchronized because of the wireless projection. But what you're looking at is technology, and there's a lot of stuff up there academically. This is from the University of Washington, that maps onto a person's face what they didn't say. And it's indistinguishable today. There's lots out there. This is mapping what Obama said earlier with the current image. This is an actor who talks like Obama, and they're getting Obama to actually respond to what he says. This is the world we live in today, and it becomes indistinguishable. I'll give you a top hint. Right now, this year, if you want to know whether the video is fake or not, look at the eyes, because the AI is still not. There's a technical reason for this. If you ask me, I'll tell you why. But if you look at a video and the person is not blinking, that's a fake video. If the person is blinking, then that's true. It might change next year. It might change next year as the AI increases. There's a technical reason for that. I'll tell you that in Q&A if you want. But this is so dangerous. This is so devastating that 2 weeks ago, 3 senators wrote to the Director of National Intelligence in the United States. This is the word for this is called deep fake. It comes from the word of pornography, actually, where you have your favorite, usually a female Hollywood actress, superimposed digitally to a pornographic actress's video, and it appears as if that person was actually in that video. So this phenomenon called deep fakes, as you can see, is a national security threat that the senators are saying the Director of National Intelligence should be looking at. And this is what I told you about before we started talking. This is a report from the British House of Commons, the British Parliament, and this is unprecedented. This came out at the end of July, where it's the most comprehensive report from a national legislation in Europe looking at the phenomenon of fake news and also algorithmic generation of misinformation. So this report in its entirety is there, and they also flag and frame some of the concerns that I've articulated here. Now this is actually even more frightening. There's this term called psychometric. I won't go into it too much, but psychometric manipulation is manipulating your psychology through certain ways in which you can influence people over social media. At its simplest, it's that. It sounds like science fiction, but this is, I won't show you the URL because I think it will be a bit unethical, but you can, if you want, Google it. It's called Spinner. And on Spinner for $29, I can get things that would show up on a target of my choice that influence them to do that. So if I wanted my girlfriend to have, get into bed with me, over 3 months for $29, I can have 108 impressions of articles that psychologically promote the fact that I want her to, get into bed with me. And these are real companies. This is not science fiction. This is not a joke, right? This is using, things that marketing and advertisers have used for many decades, but it's scaling it up. It's hyper personal, and obviously the same kind of things. I mean, this is for drugs and sex, drugs and a good time. But just imagine in the world of politics, right? And studies around this have already been there and done around the nature of what is called psychometric profiling and targeting during the US elections and also during Brexit as well. And part of the response to all of this bad AI is now good AI. AI systems like I showed earlier that are coming out. This is a platform called AdVerify, which looks at the kind of virality of ads and the money that they generate to ensure that ads that promote hate, hurt, or harm or violence don't go viral. So companies are using this kind of platform to make sure that they don't advertise their content alongside other content that might be quite bad. This is actually an award-winning platform out of the United Kingdom. The person who started this, I think he's a Syrian immigrant to the United Kingdom. He won an award from the Prime Minister's office for this. It's one of the it's one of the British government's leading examples of good AI. It's called Factmata, and essentially the idea is also that you use AI to stop the spread of misinfo over media and social media. This is DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Some of you may have heard of. And Dr. Turek is running this incredible program, multi-year program, again specifically looking at AI and misinfo at scale. And the idea is that you come up then with platforms and strategies and tools and services and ways in which algorithmically using AI, a lot of what we talked about the bad stuff can be curtailed. This is out of Mexico. It's called Verificado. This is in around the Mexican election. The whole platform is crowdsourced as well as AI around the stopping of the spreading of misinfo around the electoral process in Mexico. It's actually quite a bad problem. It's a multifaceted, complex problem, and this kind of platform is coming up. And interestingly, Adobe, which made Project Voco and which makes Photoshop, which you can do stuff, is, I mean, I won't show you the video again, this is Googleable. There's now an in-house research team that is looking at ways that Adobe itself can give us the tools through which Adobe's AI can be identified by us. Yeah, so I mean, it's like, it's really quite weird. But Adobe knows that its technology is going to be used for bad, and it's trying to actually, figure out and give us the tools to help us as end users or citizens maybe understand a bit better whether what we are seeing is true or not. And I don't have time for the video, but the video is, the lead scientist of the video is featured in this story, and it's really quite interesting. And the other thing that social media is doing, I mean, I can't speak about what I talked about on Monday and Tuesday in Facebook because of an NDA, but it's public domain knowledge that a lot of social media companies are now doing something that they never thought they'd be doing. Why? Because the entirety of social media was about something called frictionless sharing, right? Reducing the problems around sharing to an extent where it's easy to share. Where you read something, share. Read something, like. Read something, comment with one thumb. Now they are introducing ways in which it's made more difficult. So this is a design problem as well. And by making it more difficult, they're trying to pause the viral spread of bad content. So for example, in India, many of you, I think it has been reported here as well, the problems that WhatsApp has caused in India. experience, it's really, really bad. WhatsApp itself is not necessarily the problem that is instigating all of this, but it's actually creating lynch mobs that have gone and done horrible things, including killing people. And what now WhatsApp is doing globally, what WhatsApp is doing in India is making it difficult for you to, at scale, forward messages or content. So in India, you can only forward it to 5 people, and globally, as a consequence of what happened in India, you can now only forward it to, I think, around 20. So this is ways in which platforms are building friction in. And you have this other thing called platform transparency, also not very well known, even though now it's a couple of months old. You have like your Swiss president, I understand, and the foundation's webpage. If you go to our pages, right at the bottom, there's now a new tab called Info and Ads. Every public page has this now. And when you go to Info and Ads, it basically, Facebook tells you what kind of ads or what kind of information operations have been running associated with this page. So you know if this person has been running ads. You know if the person has been running ads, what kind of ads they are. So now Facebook tracks all the spending that people like us, the foundation, or anybody who runs an ad campaign, if it's a public page, they now have a tab that you can go and check it out. They now have an entirely different page. This is the Facebook page for, it's called the Ad Archive. It was launched about 2-3 months ago. Reciprocally, there's also something on Twitter which does the same thing. It's called the Ads Transparency Center. This is all public domain. If you go to one of these and you type in a name or an account, it will tell you whether those individuals have been running an ad and for how long, and where the target audience has been, and what the kind of nature of the ad. So it's whether or not they take down the ad, it's archived for posterity. So they can take it down, but it's still archived here. I want to come to the end, and I want to just say, I've been talking a lot about technology, but is the solution purely technological or technocratic? I don't think so. I don't think that social media has the keys to this kind of complexity in my part of the world, for example, where there's a democratic deficit and a government and successive governments that don't believe that applying the rule of law and media literacy is important. So they always like to blame social media and Silicon Valley and Facebook, but I don't think that that's necessarily the solution. I also don't think that technology offers the entirety of a solution. So this is Credit Suisse, and I think every year they come out with a barometer of Swiss perceptions and what you believe, your trust in public institutions. We do this kind of thing in Sri Lanka as well, and it's very different. But from last year, you still have a very high degree of trust around public institutions, your government, the law, policing, etc. So it's actually an enviable country for the likes of us. But I mean, I understand. My French is sketchy, but it's interesting that year on year there's been a loss of about 5 to 6 percentage points around media and fake news. So even in a mature democracy like this, it is still having an impact on what the public perceive to be and their engagement with mainstream media, and we don't know whether this is a trend line or an aberration. And I want to end by a philosophical note. I mean, I think the challenge that we have is the debate between logos and pathos. Is it the reasoned, logical mind in a democracy that we have to strengthen, or is it the emotive, viral kind of sharing of information that today we take for granted that is now the new bedrock of democracy? And I don't have a definite answer to this, but I think the central tension of democracy moving forward, undergirded by artificial intelligence and all of what we talked about, is this contest between the reasoned, rational, logical engagement with difference so that it doesn't descend to violence. So if you and I disagree, we can still have a coffee or drink about it and agree to disagree, and we don't try to kill each other. And the kind of emotive, violent, narcissistic, communal, tribal hate, hurt and harm that is promoted in a viral manner over these platforms, and augmented and strengthened by default using the artificial intelligence that powers all of these platforms. I think that is the central question of what we're talking about. Thank you very much. I don't we have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sanjana. So I think please carry on directly.
How much of it? Swiss are very particular about time, so how much of time do we have?
Let's start and then we see.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned before that this House of Commons report came up with some policy recommendations, regulatory recommendations.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that problem. Probably most of us were aware, but showed it very dramatically. Where should regulation now step in? I mean, what's the right approach?
Well, I mean, the House of Commons isn't prescriptive, and they acknowledge that even in the United Kingdom, it's really quite hilarious. They say that it's the disconnect within government that has stymied a response. So it's not as if they don't know about the threat, it's the fact that they can't have a coordinated approach to it. It's not that there is no legislative framework already present, but it's just that it's the non-application or the partial application that's the problem. So legislatively, they're thinking of setting up new institutions, including the news yesterday of a new body in the United Kingdom as a regulatory authority, which is going to be set up and mandated to look at hate speech on social media, and is going to have punitive measures in the legislative framework of that body, sort of like Ofcom, that will, like Germany's law, be able to have punitive measures against social media companies that don't take down hate proactively or upon reporting in a particular stipulated time frame. So that is a new body that they're thinking of. In the report, it's actually a whole of government approach. They are encouraging all of government to look at the ways in which all of them can use the existing laws, but also maybe new regulations dealing specifically with social media in particular. But for me, the fourth pillar, the fourth recommendation is a long-term one that they actually very, very strongly come out in favor of, which is with the Ministry of Education, or the equivalent ministry in the United Kingdom, where they say that from the kindergarten level, this is something that you now need to be talking about and teaching, where media literacy is integral, inextricably entwined with democracy in the United Kingdom. And it's the fact that today millennials don't know how to question what they consume that is contributing to this. It's a longer term solution that they say that you don't have short term answers to. But it's a very interesting report because it brings together private company, private sector, transatlantic cooperation as well with the United States. It has a very European stance in one respect because it talks about the defense of privacy against what can go wrong in Silicon Valley and under Mr. Trump in particular. But it talks about also the public-private partnerships and regulatory mechanisms as well, which you probably understand far better. But I found it to be a very progressive report and also a very humble report because they make no qualms. They don't say that the United Kingdom government and Her Majesty's government is ahead of the curve. It's a warning, and actually the whole report is about Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit. But the end is actually, I think, far. I sent it with a note to my Prime Minister, along with another report coming out of Oxford from the Computational project around the same time, suggesting that my government needs to read that. Of course, in my government, there's no guarantee that they'll understand it. Perhaps you are lucky in that respect, but it's a valuable report.
You showed at the beginning with the Coca-Cola example that we don't really know what is inside the box. Dealing now with these big companies like Google, Facebook, do you have the impression that they're gonna uncover their secrets, or are we still facing business models where we do not know what they really are doing?
It's a fundamentally important question. That is the question. The simple answer is no, they're not. They're not going to make what is called algorithmic transparency the default operating procedure of those companies. What they are doing, I think everybody is doing, is they're taking measures. They're introducing Coke Zero. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Yeah, they're making it healthier, but they're not releasing the recipe.
It's design.
It's still a profit imperative. But they are, I think, now deeply and acutely aware, and in the case of Facebook with Myanmar, I think criminally culpable. It's not a joke. They can be, we don't know, but in the months ahead they can be called to testify in front of the ICC. That they are part of the fabric of what gave rise to social violence in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and in India, and in other contexts as well. That does not mean, however, that there is any interest in algorithmic transparency. But I think this is something that we need to ask for. This is something that Switzerland and many others need to constantly remind Silicon Valley. The foundation is also, and Regina and others have hinted at this, that we need this transparency at multiple levels. At its simplest level, if I go onto Facebook, I know some things that we have suggested is that if I want to read Fox News or stuff that is deeply conservative or Breitbart, I need to have the way in which I could do that. Yeah. So I think there are multiple levels in which you can cut this, but I think it's still an active discussion. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I'm involved in media education with students, and the problems are very often quite similar. My students, they don't have trust in scientific information. They don't have trust in good media, and actually they distrust in everything. And after your presentation, I see that the problem I'm involved in has sort of like a global and very political context. Now, going back to my students, it's often how do you build up trust? And going back to the last dichotomy you did present, the Greek dichotomy, logos versus pathos. I'm not sure if this is a good dichotomy, because what I gotta teach my students is also something emotional. Building up trust means also building good emotions towards scientific institutions, towards good media.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that this sort of like emotional approach is also relevant on a global political context.
Yeah. So there are two questions there, I think. The second one, I completely agree with you. I wasn't prefacing or giving primacy to logos over pathos or vice versa. I said that the contest is actually how you get this balance right. What are the recipes? 50-60, 60-40, 50-50, 75-25? Is it contextually driven? Is it dependent on the actors and the language? Is it globally applicable? Is it determined by Silicon Valley or local governments? Does the United Nations step in? I think that's the conversation we need to be having, at a higher level, at a macro level. So we have no principal disagreement about that, and I think that news it's an emotive thing. I'm emotionally attached to my country. I have a vested emotional response to when I read something that is detrimental to the future of my country. It's not an intellectual thing. My response as an academic now may be increasingly logical and rational and data-driven and scientific. But as a citizen, as a father, as somebody who grew up in what I grew up, it's a very emotional. I am passionate about my future of the country, and I think that I teach at university back home as well, and my first lecture is always about me being silent and asking my students, who are actually mid-career professionals, to ask me a question, which is to get them to unlearn what they have learned. Because in Sri Lanka, the education system doesn't ask you to question. It asks you to just listen to a lecturer or a teacher and just copiously write down notes, and at an exam just vomit it out, right? So I think that the way in which media literacy, and actually it's in the report that I mentioned, there's a lot of work being done in America actually, before Trump as well, but now increasingly so, is to get our students, our children, to ask questions about what they consume. It's less about getting them to agree with pro-democratic or pro-Obama or pro-Trump or our political bias. That's, with my son, it's less about getting him to agree with me, but it's more about getting him to question and coming to his own understanding through questioning to what he believes in. In my son's case, in everything, including his religion and whatever he wants to pursue. So I think that is what, at least in my country, in my part of the world, we don't encourage. I don't know what the Swiss education system is. My only interaction with is through Hong's and Daniel's son, who's turned out to be a wonderful gentleman and a young adult. But I think that is also a combination of parenting and schooling. Right? I think that you have to address these questions at that level. over the longer term. Over the shorter term, I think there's a whole conversation about Silicon Valley and government and regulations and everything that everybody else can do. But I think you, sir, are at the heart of this. You are the custodian of how this generation is going to respond to this kind of thing. Because AI is not going away. Misinfo is not going away. Computational propaganda is getting so sophisticated that you will not in a few years be even able to identify it, much less study it. Right? And there's a whole different discussion as well. So I think where does society end up at? You end up with individuals who have to natively know or natively realize the importance of critical question and critical cognitive engagement with the content. And I think it can be done. Some countries are doing it, and we need to learn. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, no. I think
We had in Switzerland, 2 days ago, we had some very interesting discussion about our DNA in relation to digital sovereignty. So what are our core values in this world we are seeing now, and how do we build that? And it has a lot to do with education, but it has also to do with an understanding of our leadership about the technology and in all facets, and that's quite challenging also here. And there is a deep understanding that the direct democratic system we have is at risk. You see, and not a lot of people still have this understanding, and it's used also just now for the next election next year. See, this is going on here in Switzerland, and we are actually not really prepared. Nobody here in Switzerland is really prepared. That was an interesting finding yesterday. We are not prepared.
I can only say as a humble visitor to your country that I think that's a discussion Daniel and others and you can have in the room. I can't speak to that, but I can speak to the fact that all countries need to have this discussion. I think the understanding that AI and this kind of scenario is only limited to the West, or reciprocally, that what I talked about are risk vectors only in the global South, I think that's false. This is a shared issue. It's not about, for me, Russia or Mr. Trump or Duterte in the Philippines or Mr. Modi in India. It is about the vectors and the platforms and the services that are rendered available to authoritarianism and dictatorship and the worst of our passions that put the better angels and the best of us and the best of who we can be at risk. That's a social, political, economic and cultural discussion I think that needs to occur. I will end by saying that I share with you the fact that legislators don't necessarily have the information or knowledge or capacity to engage in the discussion. And I had a discussion with the wonderful gentleman who's hosting us today, and I said part of the problem that I have with governments in my part of the world is that they would say, yes, we need to have this discussion, but they would then come up with legislation that is censorious. They would say that this is against hate speech and everything. I mean, they would agree, but then that's what we call dual-use legislation. So the next day, when there's a political opponent saying something that is bad, they would say that's fake news, and they would shut you down. Right. So we are very concerned in our part of the world about also governments taking the lead. Not to say that they don't have a role, but we have to be also as citizens, I think, very, very cautious and careful about legislatures who don't understand and who come onto this with maybe not the most democratic of intent. But that's a question the Swiss need to have. Sorry, you had a question.
Sajana, you are showing this wonderful analysis on the dependency between accounts, or let's say fake accounts, when they spread news, or the dependency between links on similar, seemingly unrelated accounts.
Yeah.
Is it possible? Are there any means to do at least a basic analysis of this type if you are just an administrator of a small Facebook page and you get attacked, or?
Yes. Yes and no. You see the problem. Yes, it depends on what degree you want and the depth you want to go in. The issue with Facebook in particular, but also a lot of these companies, that after Cambridge Analytica, they are shutting down access to a lot of that intelligence from outsiders. They have programs now, if you're an academic, that they will give you preferential, vetted access. But you have to go through ETH or a reputed university, which if I was doing a doctorate, I wouldn't have access to. So some of the things that we are saying that you need to also give civil society this information as well. Just because Cambridge Analytica, because of your own idiocy and lack of data protection, used it in a manner that was very detrimental, doesn't mean that you shut off access to everybody, because it can be very helpful. There are open source software tools that I use. All of this is open source. Most of this is open source. There are also other ways that social science researchers can get this information. So depending on what you want to look at, over what temporal period, and to which depth, there are ways in which you can do this. But if you want to actually have digital forensics and do computational propaganda research that's a bit more robust, you need both technical knowledge, specialist knowledge, and you need access to great amounts of data which you can't get in the public domain. So it depends on what you want to do. Yeah.
I have a question about
Daniel, I'm relying on you for time, right?
Oh, we're doing fine.
Yeah.
We're doing fine.
about what you said about algorithmic transparency and the question related to Facebook and maybe this more idealistic request to Facebook to provide for algorithmic transparency. My question is, what would you say? Would they be able to provide algorithmic transparency, or is technological development now already there? Like the black box thing, the technological type coupling that you cannot even say anymore. What happens in the black box, especially with autonomous algorithms? So, can we even hope for that? Is this even a reasonable request at some point? Maybe you have something to add from your last
I can't.
talk.
I can't. I really can't. I can say though that that's a fundamental question, and I think in the public domain you will find the fact that Facebook just this year they're going to set up in the coming days what they call a war room for electoral misinfo. I saw that actually. So they're going to, starting in the United States, but it's going to extend to all elections around the world because Facebook is so central to anything. They're coming up with ways in which users can more easily report rumor and misinfo. In Australia 2 days ago, they started with an experiment that is now live in the United States, where you see something on the news feed and there's a button where you get contextual analysis of the news source. So if it's the New York Times, you get where that article is shared, who the New York Times is, how much it has been shared, by whom. So you get a frame of the news source. So you get the FB gives you an understanding of what you're actually consuming. That's live now in Australia as of 1 day ago. So they're trying to make the news feed a bit more open and transparent. My sense though is that, I think you hit the nail on the head, that you have already reached a level of complexity. Take the stock market and how Wall Street operates. I don't think that any trader knows the system. We have seeded, and many years ago already, the decisions around which stock trading is done to algorithms. And there's a whole academic research now based on, as you know, algorithms versus algorithms. And there's a wonderful story, I think, in the New York Times. No, it's actually quite something. There's a wonderful story in the New York Times where an old hospital in New York, it's really quite old, it's a public hospital. And on top of the public hospital is this spaghetti of wiring and antennas and communications equipment that has nothing to do with the hospital. Why? Why is it on the roof? The roof provides a direct line of communication for algorithms that are trading in Wall Street. And you know what the advantage is? It's maybe 0.1 millisecond.
Yes.
Right? But that 0.1 millisecond translates into hundreds of millions of dollars. Right?
So they trade our pension schemes.
What they do for it is actually a different conversation, but I think that this is the world we're living in, where the complexity is not easily explainable by humans anymore. Now, I don't think that Google and Microsoft and Apple and Facebook are still at that level, but they might be at that level in the years to come. But I don't think that we need to stop asking for algorithmic transparency. As I said, I think that they are not even talking about giving the user the ability to switch what they want to read. I don't want Google or Microsoft or Facebook to be the arbiter of truth either. I don't want Silicon Valley to tell me this is of a higher veracity than something else. I want to be able to kind of switch between what I want to actually consume. I want to be confronted with difference. I want to be confronted with political opinion that I don't agree with. And the way they are going now is actually to kind of talk more about misinfo and giving you more of what you agree with, as opposed to creating a healthy public discourse, which for me is about dealing with difference as well. I mean, otherwise it's just an echo chamber, right? Those are not things that they're talking about. I think it's an ongoing discussion, but I think the work that you do and to raise that question, I think is of phenomenal importance.
And think about the toxicological, pathological part if somebody is attacking the algorithm, which is actually planned. And then you have actually absolutely no guarantee, you have no clue what's really going on.
Two questions. So 3 questions.
It's actually not a question.
Oh.
Talking about Google, a few months ago they came up with AI principles. I mean, they published AI principles. And the first principle, I think, it's on be socially beneficial. That's the first principle. Transparency is not a principle.
No, they don't talk about it. Yeah? It's Coke Zero.
Yeah.
It's the Coke Zero. You still drink Coke, but it's good for you.
Yeah. Your question about the black box, I think it's really a problem.
Yeah.
Because here with Facebook and so on, you can say, oh, they aren't interested to give it outside. But for example, in health, there is a big discussion about explainable AI, and there is a lot of research to get an insight in these mostly neural networks and to translate it in human readable, human understandable terms. But at the moment, nobody is really able to explain.
No, it is actually there's also academic research that has done AI on sexual orientation, that looks at facial profiling and then tries to determine what your sexual orientation is, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual. Very problematic. There is now about 3 days or 4 days ago, IBM publicly announced AI that audits AI around employment decisions and bias towards gender or a particular Caucasian or a particular demographic. Because AI is so complex, and some of these companies now are basing their initial procurement or employment decisions based on AI that scans you and your value for the company based on parameters that you don't know. Last week, I think when we were in Menlo Park, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, took Facebook to court in the United States for discriminatory practices that are possible on the platform for advertising that discriminates against women. Because you can target only men, and Facebook as an advertising platform has had many civil liberties cases brought against it that are discriminated against a particular demographic. And so, the oversight of this is now being done by AI as well, but fundamentally I think AI can lead to discrimination. This is a larger conversation that we've had lectures on elsewhere around the kind of governance around AI that underpins our smart cities. The kind of decisions that that Regina has been talking about in the laws domain, and more fundamentally, and perhaps more simply, I mean, what are the algorithmic principles and oversight, leave aside the fake and misinfo and the disinfo domain that govern the decisions that our devices are now making on our behalf, including self-driving cars. These black box algorithms, we blindly trust, have no means by which to question, are not open for critical debate, and even our legislators in national governments have no access to. It's quite an interesting world, really. And I think we need to question this writ large. It's beyond the scope of this lecture, but I think the both of you actually have hit an interesting.
At the moment, the only hope is it's absurd to take AI to explain AI. There is no other way.
Well, yes, but the thing
of course
is,
you have feature engineering and all before. This can lead to different results, but what's actually going on inside?
No, I agree with you. It's one level absurdity, but I also don't think that we are already inhabit a world that is that a human can grasp. There's too much of data, there's too much of complexity. I don't think that the algorithmic transparency, I think, I would refer you to what New York City is doing. It's the world's first initiative, and Regina knows this, where the city, the New York City, wants algorithmic transparency, and they set it up last year. And there's a really interesting discussion around how the city is going to hold accountable for city services and the provisioning of public services algorithms for bias and for other things. So they are demanding algorithmic transparency. First example in the world, and they're all looking to see where that goes. But I don't think that it's easy to demand algorithmic transparency because AI is so complex. So you had a question in the front end. Maybe then we stop. I don't know.
No, we have still.
Okay.
Unless you.
No, I'm fine. I just don't,
We are fine.
The wrath of Swiss when you go over time is something I don't want to encounter. How are you?
It's a good experience.
I think we've run out of questions.
One more. Aren't we too much focused on Silicon Valley? I mean, there is China developing AI, etc., etc. Are we a little bit Western-centric in our perspective here?
So my lecture was about AI and fake news and misinfo and disinfo, where the central arbiters in every other market outside of China is Silicon Valley. And that's also a new political, social phenomenon. Within China, you have Sine Weibo and a number of other platforms and services and apps that run within that country in an information domain that is actually quite sophisticated. An academic who has studied this calls it the 3 Fs, that the information domain operates on the principles of fear, flooding, and friction. Fear around what will happen to you in case you put something that is not kosher. Flooding, as I said, to drown out inconvenient truths, not by explicitly censoring, but by drowning out with stuff that is of little value or entertainment that drowns out the political critique, and friction by actually making it hard to put up content. So you won't censor a critical website, you'll just make the DNS resolution harder. You won't censor a particular app, but you'll make it that much harder, or you'll throttle the bandwidth so it becomes harder for you to get the app. And Google has done research that suggests that I think something ridiculous, I think less than a 1 second delay in the search results generation means that you will not go from the first result on the first page. It's ridiculous when you read it, but they have looked at the aggregate of trillions of data points that they have that suggest that just by increasing the friction, you are actually controlling the flow. Right? So these are the 3 Fs that China uses. I haven't talked about it because I'm not a domain expert in the information landscape of China, but I think the broad principles hold. And China as a bad faith actor, I think, needs to be tempered with Russia and the United States as now bad faith actors, where the liberal democratic factions and ideas don't hold true anymore in the way that perhaps they did before 2016. The other thing is that I think that a more general discussion around AI, specialized or generalized, there are colleagues in the room who can speak to that far better than I can, which is actually a broader discussion, whether it's facial recognition through CCTV, where China is leading the world, or philosophically the project of AI in China, which is the generation and cultivation of information from the population in an authoritarian domain, where you have an incredible wealth of information that in a country like Switzerland you really can't imagine, because it's hugely invasive of privacy. But that is why, fundamentally, you have the American model of AI, and now you have the Chinese model of AI, and the bets are on as to who's going to develop the better AI.
We are all exhausted. But,